This is Ritual 9, and let's review for just a minute or two the shape of the education. And in order to realize the shape of our education, we must pursue a strategy. And this strategy is an ancient technique. Now, the shape of the education is a double cycle. The first cycle is a cycle of nature, and the second cycle is a cycle of consciousness. So that our education deals with nature and consciousness. Nature, simply put, is a clockwise cycle. It's a motion that approaches circularity. And indeed, if you left nature to itself, unpopulated by consciousness, it would be very much akin to a circle, a cycle that closes upon itself. Consciousness, in its cycle, on the other hand, literally on the other hand, nature being a clockwise motion, consciousness is an anti-clockwise motion. It works the other way. It goes a different way. Its processes are distinctly different from nature, though related to them, so that we could say that the natural cycle has an integration mode and the conscious cycle has a differentiation mode, so that integration and differentiation together make our education, make the complete shape of our education. The traditional symbol of nature is that of a mandala, of a circle divided into fours, divided into quarters, into quaternaries, a vertical axis that gives a penetrative quality, and a horizontal axis that gives an equanimous quality, so that nature in its cycle has an alternation of penetration and equanimity. The equanimity is very often there as a phase of process, that when process is predominant, you have equanimity. But when objectivity is predominant, then you have a penetration quality. So that the cycle of nature alternates between process and objectiveness. And nature, being the very first quarter of the circle, of the mandala, of the cycle, of the integration mode, nature is a process. In no way is objective, is a matrix of change. And as nature is a process, in the first quarter of 4, the second quarter is the alternation from process, which is objectivity. And the second phase in our education is ritual, which is the first phase of objectivity. Nature is the first phase, and also the first phase of process. Ritual is the second phase, yet is the first phase of objectivity. The third phase of our integration mandala, of our cycle, of our circle of the natural order, is myth, and myth is also a process. So that the alternation goes from process to objectivity to process and back again to objectivity. So that nature as a process is first, ritual as an objectivity is second, myth as a process is third, and symbol as a second objectivity is fourth. So the cycle of integration, the circle of integration, the first year of our education is nature, ritual, myth, and symbol. But differentiation as a mode which characterizes consciousness moves in a counterclockwise fashion, and the four-part cycle of differentiation of consciousness begins with vision, and vision also, because it alternates with symbol, it alternates from symbol. So vision is a process, a third process. So that if you were looking at an alignment, you would see that nature, myth, and vision are aligned as three processes. And just as ritual and symbol align, the sixth phase, which is art, also aligns. So looking at a linearity of alignment, you would see that nature, myth, and vision align, and that ritual, symbol, and art align. So that symbols, in a way, are a fulcrum, are an arbitration between ritual and art. And myth, likewise, is a central arbiter. It's a fulcrum between nature and vision. So that myth and symbol are extremely powerful, extremely important. But there is another kind of process that comes into play in consciousness. It is difficult but possible to imagine vision from the natural cycle, but it is not possible at all to imagine history from nature. History is the second process in the differentiation cycle of consciousness. And history is a process which aligns itself with vision. And likewise aligns itself with myth and with nature. But history, being as far from nature as you can get, is not visible at all from nature. And nature being directly opposite of myth, being not so much its opposite, but its contrapositive. History is exactly what myth is not. And in the same way, vision is exactly what nature is not. So if you had a mandala of the processes of the two cycles, you would have nature, myth, vision, and history, abstracting and excerpting the four processes. But this cycle of nature, which is nature, ritual, myth, and symbol, and then its counter movement, the cycle of differentiation, which begins with vision, and then has art, and then has history, has a fourth movement, and that fourth movement again, because history is a process, the fourth movement is a phase of objectivity. And that fourth phase of consciousness, that second phase of objectivity, art being the first, is known as science. So that in a way, the objectivities of consciousness are art and science. And thus, in a higher education, one has, at least in the old Renaissance model, departments of the arts and sciences. If you go to a Renaissance-based university, you will find a building labeled Arts and Sciences. And that's why the arts and the sciences were put together, because they are the objectivities of consciousness. They are what make manifest the achievements of the differentiating energy. Just so, the manifestations, the objectivity in nature is ritual and symbol. So if you visited a tribe in their au naturel cultural setting, they would show you the rituals and symbols. But if you went to a civilization and went to a university, they would show you the arts and sciences. And so tribes and civilizations characterize two great movements of human intelligence. The tribal have rituals and symbols, and the universities have arts and sciences. Our education takes all of this together, because all of this must be together. And we must move to be able to move all the way from nature to science. And what characterizes science is the transformation of nature into a cosmos. So the objectivity, the object of science, is the cosmos as a manifest, objective actuality. Does the cosmos exist? You bet. Where is it? There. The sun in the day, the starry expanse at night. You can look at it any time that you wish. The objectivity of art is in the artist. Without the artist, there is no art. Rembrandts don't happen without a Rembrandt. You cannot take a Lucas Cranach and have a Rembrandt. You will have Cranachs. And if you see Cranach's portrait of Martin Luther, it's a Cranach. It is not a Rembrandt. So there are different kinds of artists producing different kinds of art. They are all art, but it's centered upon the artist, which means, for our educational purposes, the person. So that art has to do with the person, and science has to do with the cosmos. And that on a civilization level, where the arts and sciences are the focus of a university, a true mature education in its treatment of consciousness deals with persons and the cosmos. And person and cosmos are mediated by a process known as history. And history is so difficult to negotiate. The ocean of the process of history is such a difficult ocean to navigate on that without the art of the person, one could never find one's way to the cosmos. And so this education is an education summing up all of the previous developments of education, from Paleolithic times right up to the space age. It takes in all the achievements of nature and ritual, the achievements of myth and symbol, and adds to them the achievements of vision and art and of history and science. And so the entire accomplishment of our species, of our being, of our type of conscious nature is summed up here in this education. Now we're in a process of understanding ritual. We have had 3 months on nature, and now we're 3 months on ritual. Yet to come this year will be 3 months on myth and 3 months on symbol. And then next year we'll have 3 months on vision, 3 months on art, 3 months on history, 3 months on science. At that point, after 2 years, after 8 quarters, we will have surveyed in slow motion a double movement, a circumambulation of the integral mode and a complementary circumambulation of the differential mode. And our education will be complete. We will have seen what cannot be seen at any single point except the rare point of the center. For only at the rare point of the center, where the two cycles are tangent at one point and one point only, a point which vanishes in upon itself and therefore is called the vanishing point. In India it's called Bindu. In Buddhism it's called Nirvana or Dharma. In the West it's the mystical place of the emptiness of the world and the fullness of divinity. Sometimes it's called the soul, sometimes it's called the deep self, Sometimes it's called the meditative point, that is so intense it drops out of the world from its sheer veracity of exactness. The world based upon nature, which is always in motion, cannot contain the exactness of realization. And so it is free to go wherever it wishes to go, being no longer bound, not bound by the integral cycle. And so very often in ancient wisdom, the circle of nature is centered upon a point, a focus, which has no existence and yet is more real than the entirety of the cycle of nature. The ancient wisdom tradition of the West was summed up when they founded the city of Alexandria and made a beautiful university, the first great university in the entire world. It was called the Museum, meaning the House of the Muses, meaning the place where all of the arts and sciences of consciousness came together with all of the achievements of rituals and symbols. And so you had a great university. And one of the teaching methods of that first Alexandrian university was to teach geometry. And the great Alexandrian teacher of geometry was named Euclid. And he wrote a textbook on geometry called The Elements. And The Elements of Euclid is still in print 2,300 years later. You can buy it in Dover paperbacks in 3 volumes. High school students around the world study Euclid's geometry. It's called plane geometry. And the whole motion of geometry begins with a definition, an axiomatic presentation of the definition of a point. And in Euclid, on page 1, paragraph 1, the first point in geometry about the point is that the point is a locus with no dimension. And when the locus of no dimension, the point, moves, its movement creates a line. And the vibrancy of the line describes a plane. And if you set the plane on edge, you would see a line. But intuiting that the line has a whole plane behind it, the ancient wisdom called that line, the edge of the plane, a horizon. And the first horizon is the horizon of the earth and sky where they meet. And the horizon of the earth and sky where they meet, that plane, is cut by a penetrative axis of ascent and descent. Above the plane is an ascent, below the plane is a descent. And one can ascend to the highest, which is the zenith, and the zenith is a vanishing point overhead. It's the focus of the overhead brought to such an exactness that it disappears into infinity. And the descent is a descent that goes to the nadir. And the nadir is such a plunge into such an abyss that its point vanishes out of sight. So the vanishing of the nadir and the vanishing of the zenith and the vanishing point of integration, when they are aligned together, they produce, because it's an alignment of infinities with zero, with a Zen-like emptiness. When emptiness and 2 infinities are aligned together, one has a fullness that has always been described as beyond comprehension, or the realm of the divine, or sometimes is called God. At least the portal, the threshold, the capacity to, for the first time, be able to understand, to be able to see the beyond. Now, ancient wisdom traditions from Alexandria on down to the present day always assumed that if human beings were able to inhabit a civilization, they would need this kind of education to sustain it. A tribal education is not enough to sustain a civilization. And a symbolic mind is not enough to sustain a civilization. One needs the art of the person and the science of the cosmos to sustain a civilization. And lacking these, instead of fullness, one has less than fullness. Instead of health, one has disease. And instead of the maturity of fullness, one has the disease of regression. And the regression always goes back to the last stable level that was able to be maintained. Now, when the stability of the objective cosmos cannot be maintained, because one does not master history, have you never heard of God as the Lord of history? The God who inhabits the cosmos as his realm, as his kingdom, is the Lord of history. And without being able to master history, one cannot master the cosmos. And so one regresses back to the person. The inability of the person to sustain themselves, because the challenge is always that one must then face history. And so the regression continues back to the symbol level, because the cosmos, the person, the symbol being the mind. And so one regresses back to the mind. But very often it takes a lot of attentiveness to even maintain the objectivity of a mind. It takes much more energy, much more perseverance to maintain the person, because the person is a differential objectivity, far transcends the ability of the mind, simply the mind. Just as the cosmos far transcends the objectivity of the person. If you were to place the person vis-a-vis the mind and the cosmos, the person would be like a prism about midway. But the mind is not easily sustainable in its objectivity, and so regression goes back to ritual, the original basic level. And ritual is always objectified in the body. So if the cosmos is not sustainable, if one doesn't have the maturity to sustain the cosmos, one goes back to the person. And if you don't have the differential consciousness to sustain the person, one goes back to the mind. And without the symbolic accuracy of the mind, which is taught by geometry, one goes back to ritual. One goes back to the body. There, most people can sustain themselves. And their education comes to rest in a regressive way with concern of exercise, of going to gymnasiums to produce health so that one can then feel good about oneself in life. This is the lowest level. This is like flatworm level, but without the integral push towards the maturation beyond the body, one begins to lose the process which comes out of the ritual level and leads to all those higher levels. That process is the mythic process, and its medium of conveyance is language. And as language begins to atrophy, as the mythic process begins to be less and less usable, less and less familiar, one begins to forget, because the regression is of forgetting. One comes back to a very clumsy kind of ritual. No longer the ritual vivified from nature and leading into the great mythic expressions of experience, but a regressive ritual which becomes mechanically distributed, becomes manipulated by hierarchies of regressive dependence, and that kind of ritual is always referred to as the prison of the world, as samsara, as the fractured, flawed world where man is held prisoner, held a slave of doctrine and of habitual addiction. And it's in this condition that the present world is rushing with all the speed of regressive hurricane. But this happens quite frequently. Not frequently in terms of years or centuries or even millennium, but in terms of millions of years of experience, it happens quite frequently. About every 2,500 years, this kind of a regression sets in. Civilizations are born, they live, and they die. Arnold Toynbee, whose study of history early in the 20th century studied 28 civilizations, 27 of which were dead. Only the one that he was participant in was still alive, and that has in the meantime expired and died. So there are no living civilizations anywhere on this planet. And as far as we know, it thus denudes the entire star system of civilization, so that consciousness has no place to be. It has no home. It has no objectivity within which to be. And so civilizations have to be renewed. They have to be born again. And so we need to have a rebirth not just of the person, but a rebirth of the cosmos, which entails a rebirthing of the mind, which entails a rebirthing of the body. And all of these concerned together as an ecology are the concern of education. And that's what's going on here. So that the scale of events that are unfolding is nothing less than the necessary application of a doctor of civilization looking to an illness of the current patient and through a diagnostic application of bringing health back on all the levels possible. And of course, this kind of activity is not welcomed or even recognized at first. It's rather a case of a complete unknown. For only in times of mature civilization would such an ecology of consciousness be seen objectively at all as something. In the regressed form of gymnasium habitués, the talk about persons in cosmos falls not only upon deaf ears, but upon beings whose ears have not yet even grown. Now, in all of this, we are now in ritual, at Ritual 9, and our concern is to continue our particular method of advancement. Not just Bacon's advancement of learning, but the progress of movement along a maturation line, a line which, if seen in its fullness, curves. Wallace Stevens once, in his theory of poetry, observed an insight about the artist Paul Klee. Stevens said of Paul Klee that Klee lived in a universe so vast that straight lines were seen to fall. And fall in an ordered, curving way, finally to come back upon themselves. For everything in nature, since it is not an objective plane, for plane geometry is an idea of the mind, is a symbolic objectivity and has nothing to do with the process of nature. Nature is not a plane that you would fall off the edge, but it's a great mystery in which it is so vast that straight lines seem to fall, and not only lines of space, but lines of time. And so those lines of space-time fall and curve and seem to be like an orbit around some mysterious center. just like a satellite in orbit around the Earth does not orbit the Earth but goes in a straight line. But because of the curvature of the Earth and the curvature, therefore, of gravity, the straight line of the orbiter falls around the Earth, actually tries to go in a straight line, and the straight line is the orbit around the Earth. Remember one time in a daring demonstration at Caltech, Kip Thorne of the black holes fame stood on a chair and took an orange, and he jumped off the chair to show that he was moving the orange in a straight line, but because he had jumped off the chair, gravity took over and very quickly brought the orange down. And so while it was moving in a straight line, gravity makes the straight line curve around the perimeter, around the limitation of its field of effect. And in the same way, nature has a gravity, a gravitas, as the Romans used to say. In their brick-like engineering practicality, that existence has a gravity to it. And the gravity is there courtesy of nature. And so all movements in nature become cycles of circles. And these cycles of circles are not only space, but also time. So that time, space, reoccurs again and again in great cycles, in great circles. And the Roman poet Ovid in the Metamorphoses, the changing process of phases, the metamorphoses, in the great epic of the Roman process mind, Ovid wrote that there are 4 ages that characterize this great ecology, this great process of the circular cycle of nature. That there's an age of gold initially, and that devolves to an age of silver, and that devolves to an age of bronze, and that devolves to an age of iron. And at the dregs of the 4th age of iron, where the world can get no worse, suddenly there is an enantiodromia. It's a term from the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, who said the world is all process. One cannot step in the same river twice. The Heraclitean word enantiodromia means there is a sudden change from the dregs of the Iron Age to the beginning of a new age of gold. And so there is a renewal of the whole process of nature in a wink of an eye, in the twinkling of an eye, in the transformative change from the decay to the rebirth. And a new age of gold begins. And so this quaternary cycle of nature, characterized by Ovid, was a process orientation. Incidentally, the objective phase was characterized by another great Roman poet, Virgil. And the Aeneid is the epic of the objective phases of integration, whereas Ovid was the poet of process, and the Metamorphoses is the epic of the movement of nature. The Greek civilization had a single great writer who had both processes. His name was Homer. And the epic of the objectivity phases of reality is the Iliad, and his great epic of the processes of consciousness and nature is the Odyssey. So that if you take all the processes, if you look at nature and consciousness from a process angle, the Odyssey is of interest to you. And if you look at nature and consciousness from the objective standpoint, from the objective phases, the Iliad is very instructive. And just as Greek civilization is founded on Homer, the 2 great cycles, Roman civilization, mimicking the Greek, because the Greeks were the teachers of the Romans, and the Romans tried to imitate. And instead of making a new civilizations, the Romans imitated the Greek And so you had a semblance of Greek civilization, which is neither Greek nor new. And that's why it fell. The makers of a new civilization were the Hellenistic Jews of Alexandria, who made a new vision. And that new vision became not only Christianity, it became, in response to that, rabbinical Judaism, and in resonance to it, Mahayana Buddhism, and in deep esoteric essence of it became the Hermetic tradition. And so one has the birth of a civilization at the same time as the attempt to make a semblance, a mimicking of a dying civilization. You cannot bring a dying civilization back by repeating that dying civilization's qualities. You end up with what the Jews call a golem. You end up with a semblance of life rather than life itself. And if you cannot tell the difference between a semblance of life from life, actually, life itself, then you are in trouble. And the trouble you are in is characterized in terms of mythic designation as the wasteland. And so when a civilization dies, the old civilization that is dying becomes the desert of the wasteland. And it is a desert because the waters of fertile creativity are withheld. They are dammed up. And where they are dammed is in the great dragon, in the great serpent that swallows its tail, that will keep the waters of life, will keep the energies of fertility locked up in itself and will not let them go. In the Rig Veda, this dragon, this serpent is called Vitra, and Vitra is whose name means resistance. Resistance itself. And the slayer of Vitra, of that great dragon of resistance, is Indra. Indra, who slays by his thunderbolt. And the old Sanskrit word that we translate as thunderbolt is Vajra, lightning. And as Zeus has his lightning bolt, Indra has his lightning bolt. And Indra and Zeus, symbolically very similar. And as Zeus conquers the dragon of Kronos, the dragon of time, the tyranny of time, Indra conquers the tyranny of space, the quality where the whole freeing waters that would give fertility to the land are held. And all of this has to do with one of our pairs of books in Ritual 9, which is From Ritual to Romance, the way in which the ancient Rig Veda links up with the Holy Grail romance, the romance of the Grail, of the great Arthurian legends and literature. The pair to it is Basho's great Zen journey, The Narrow Road to the Deep North. And there's something about the Grail and the Haiku which relate together. The Haiku is about the moment when insight is honed so fine that it penetrates through to vanishing. And the Grail is all about the cup of sacrifice that allows for the freeing from habitual wasteland, wounded unto death, habituation, back into life again. The wasteland is not so much just a desert with stones and lizards and very little vegetation, but the wasteland is a complete semblance of life, so complete that the ignorant do not know that they are living in a semblance. That is the wasteland. And so if you read T.S. Eliot's great poem, The Wasteland, which is based on Jessie L. Weston's From Ritual to Romance, if you read T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, it's not about the Gobi Desert or the Sahara Desert. It's about the stupid, addictive lives that people are condemned to lead through lack of creativity in the London and Paris of his day. And his day was the 1920s, not so very far away. And the great acceptance of the wasteland throughout the world as a great work of literature is because the entire world is now much like the soporific, semblanced London of the late Edwardian period, the Victorian London that for someone conscious not only like T.S. Eliot, but someone like James Joyce, or someone like Henry James, or someone like W.B. Yeats. And one could go on list after list after list of those who understood that it takes a heroic freeing from the addictive lures of semblance in order to penetrate through to the real. And only in the real does one feel the energies again, not only of consciousness, but of nature, of life. Because nature and consciousness, like a paired tuning fork of the real, when they are struck, either one, both of them resonate together. One of the keys to the problem and to the cure is in the image. Here are two leaves. One is a leaf from a rubber tree, and one is a leaf from a Bodhi tree. The leaf of the rubber tree in no way has a symbolic quality, whereas the Bodhi tree leaf has a marked symbolic quality. If one looked at them just as a pair of leaves, they're just leaves. In nature, they are just leaves. If one looks at them in ritual, one would, in pure ritual, just dry them out to be fodder for the fire. If one looks at them in terms of myth, just pure myth coming out of ritual, they still would not have a differentiating significance. It's only on the symbolic level, an informed symbolic level, because there has been a visionary process. Only with the visionary process of the historical Buddha does the Bodhi tree leaf become a symbol that then informs and restructures a mythology that then vivifies a ritual. So that one can say, the ritual of Buddhist meditation is a vivified, visionary quality of bringing consciousness back into nature, so that the movement of differential consciousness can revivify nature, so that the movement of differentiating consciousness is exactly the same movement as regression, except that it brings with it a vivification. So regression is not by itself an evil thing, a bad thing. Its movement is completely real in terms of the way in which things are. But it carries no energy. It carries no consciousness. And thus it goes back through and in a neutered way blanks out the achievements of integration. And one by one, all of the achievements of the process of integration are blanked out, are numbed, are put into a stasis, so that when one gets back to the ritual level, one gets back to the body. The body is a zombie. It is a numbed out, neutered quality. And thus, the ancient designation for Satan was always the Satan. The neuter article was always accompanied. Satan, the Satan, is never a man nor a woman, but always a neutered thing, whose essence of evil is that contact with it neuters you, takes you out of any kind of creative, fertile, life-giving quality. Thus, no integration is possible, and all differentiation is unimaginable. And in this wasteland, one is in need of a cure. one is in need of a freeing. We'll come back after the break. We'll come back to Basho and his haiku, and back to Jesse L. Weston's From Ritual to Romance and the Grail. We'll see how the Grail and the haiku, together with an equanimity at this third stage of ritual, ritual 9, 10, 11, and 12, will give us a chance to mature into myth in a way where myth can integrally vivify our understanding. Let's take a break. Tradition, the Tao comes quintessentially. The beyond occurs after the transformation, whereas to the East Asian mind, transformation occurs before anything happens. So in the East, the four phases are built upon the transformation of the Tao, and in the West, the beyond, the fifth phase, the quintessence, occurs after all the transformations are through. To put it bluntly and simply, in the West, you don't eat dessert until the meal is over. And in the East, you have your dessert first, and then you have your meal. So the Taoist tradition begins with a transformation. The Hermetic tradition culminates in a transformation. The West looks for a culmination. The East is relaxed in view of it already being a part of everything. The West puts the fifth phase, the quintessence, at the center. Whereas the Chinese, in order to have a 5-element typology, like the wood, wind, metal, fire, earth, puts the 5 quality in the 4 corners and also in the center, but makes the center the 3rd phase rather than the 5th. So that a Chinese square would run 1, 2, center 3, 4, 5. So that if you were drawing the line made between the 5 dots of the Chinese, you would have a line, then coming down to the center, then down to one of the corners and back over. In the Western version, one has the 4 corners and then the center. So that the center is a dot which is unconnected with the corners, whereas to the Chinese, the center is connected to all of the corners by a continuing line. So continuing alignment characterizes Tao, and surprising centeredness characterizes the Western esoteric learning. These two traditions are complementary. Basho's haiku is at the center of ongoingness. Basho is one of the great artists of the Eastern tradition, of the East Asia tradition. He assumes that the vanishing transformation point has already happened, and so the center is part of the ongoing continuity. So the haiku is not so much a punctuation at the end as it is a punctuation exactly at the center of ongoingness. Now, the way in which the haiku developed in Japan was in response to a Western technique of literature, added to an Eastern tradition of literariness. The Japanese Eastern tradition, within the developments of East Asian literature, had the haiku as the first of a series of linked verses called renga. Someone would write a haiku, and then someone else in a circle of poets would write the next verse linked to it, and someone else would write a third verse linked to the second, which links to the first. And so the linked verse would start with the haiku, and this is a Japanese technique, which is characteristic of East Asia literature and the Taoist tradition. But because there was a deep Buddhist influence and that Buddhism comes from India, it's not East Asian, but it's Western. Buddhism is linked to the Hermetic tradition and not to the Taoist tradition. The Buddha was a Westerner, not an Asian. It's very parochial to consider India as Eastern. The mythological cycles of this world include everything from Ireland to India in the same mythological horizon. E.A. Evans Wentz and his great Tibetan researches began his Tibetan researches because when he was researching for his book on the fairy faith in Celtic countries, about Celtic mythology, about Irish and ancient Celtic mythology, noticed that these themes were repeated everywhere from Ireland to India, the same themes. The same mythic patterns hold from Ireland to India. Yet China is remarkably and markedly different, and the interface between India and China was Tibet. And so Evans Wentz went to Tibet to find out where is the dividing line, what makes the difference, where is the ending of the Western mythic horizon and the beginning of the East Asian or Chinese mythic horizon. And one finds that there, on a deep level, like the level that Evans Wentz would work, there's no myth in East Asia. There's no mythic horizon per se. The mythic horizon in East Asia is occupied by Confucianism. And with our educational cycle, you can now begin to make sense out of why this is so. And more shocking and more surprising that the Chinese do not have a mythological horizon, but have a Confucian concern with Zen, where the West has its mythos. As the West would quote a myth, the Chinese would quote Confucius. There are no ongoings of Zeus and Apollo and Dionysius in China. It's what did Confucius say? The Chinese mythic horizon is there in Confucianism. And this is very surprising, but even more surprising, the observation made by Carl Jung in one of his letters, which I alluded to previously, a month or so ago. A letter in the summer of 1942 to another psychiatrist. He said, in analyzing the dreams of Chinese, one finds they do not have an unconscious. Now this should open the eyes to the size of dinner plates. If the Chinese do not have a mythological horizon, if they do not have an unconscious, then these are not as universal as one would expect. If they are not universal on this planet, there may be planets on other star systems that have nothing at all like the phases that we're acquainted with. And we may have to prepare ourselves for intelligent life that is radically different from us. and not assume so smugly that we understand what reality is all about. That it might be quite more kaleidoscopic than we even would wish. Or as Ben Jonson once said, writing in the first folio introduction to one of Shakespeare's plays, Troilus and Cressida, he said, "Dear reader, you may find herein more wit than you have brain to grind it upon." That occasionally intelligence so far exceeds that of what is ordinarily expected as to be truly extraterrestrial. Which brings us back here, back to the phases, back to the squares, back to the quaternary. The Chinese Taoist saying is that you can recognize a Taoist master because his pupils are square. And if you see someone with square pupils, with square eyes, they're really awake in the Taoist sense of tradition. This quality, where the Tao comes first and there's a 5-phase energy cycle in the East, we've talked about. We began the education with the I Ching and Thoreau. We began with a process which characterized East Asia, the I Ching, and a process which characterizes the West as Thoreau. Very few Western writers express and embody the process of nature better than Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau. And it's not so much the Thoreau even of Walden or A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers or Cape Cod, those books which are crafted works of art. But Thoreau, as a man, inhabits his journal. The 20 published volumes of his journal, many hundreds, if not thousands of pages, which he kept for decades. Thoreau is alive and well in his journal. And anytime someone reads the journal, Thoreau lives again. It was the influence of Thoreau and his journal that transformed Walt Whitman from a parochial downtown Brooklyn poet into a universal cosmic poet. The first edition of Leaves of Grass compared to the mature third edition of Leaves of Grass is case in point. You can just pick them up. The one is just a few dozen pages of self-centered poems. The other is hundreds of pages of cosmic universal person on level of yogi. Do I contain contradictions? Therefore, let me contain contradictions, says the mature Whitman. I am large enough for all, not just for both, but for every. There are phrases on Blue Ontario shore that qualify Whitman to be called a Mahayogi. And indeed, there are studies in India published that characterize Whitman as a Mahayogi. Everything from Ireland to India is in the same vein, the same mythic horizon. It has a mythos. India has a mythos, just like Ireland has a mythos, like Greece has a mythos, like the Romans have a mythos. Even the Finns have a mythos. But the Chinese do not, and the Japanese do not. Except courtesy of the import of Buddhism into China and India. And it's only through the Buddhist level of infusion that there is any kind of mythic quality in China and in Japan. Buddhist mythology there is. Basho, as one of the great poets of the East Asia tradition, takes the language of East Asia in its pure tradition, in its East Asian non-mythic tradition, and incorporates that as an ongoing moment in language, the haiku, a pure moment of presence in the ongoingness of flow to punctuate the mythic dimensions of the Buddhist or Western quality that had come into play. So that the work that we're using is not a haiku, but we're using Basho's Narrow Road to the Deep North. It is a travel sketch, it's a travel log, it's a travel journey. And the journey is always the line of a mythic development. And when journeys are set in the largest nature, the line of the journey falls and curves round the gravity of the planet. And so there are mythic circles, there are mythic cycles. And great journeys have this kind of cyclic quality. So when you look for great mythic journeys in Chinese literature, they're all influenced by Buddhism. Perhaps one of the greatest of all the Western-influenced Chinese mythic epics is that the excerpt was translated about 70 years ago by Arthur Waley called Monkey. Monkey being one of the characters in the search from China to go to India to discover the original sutras of the Buddha and bring them back to China. The travels of the monk Xuanzang in the 600s, who went all the way from China to India across the Gobi Desert and back. Only in Journey to the West, in the great Chinese epic, not just the little couple hundred pages that Arthur Waley translated, it takes 4 big, huge volumes, published in the best edition now in translation by the University of Chicago Press. It takes several thousand pages to translate the Journey to the West as a travelogue. This travel through all of the adventures that one has, this mythic horizon, is very Western in its form. And Basho, like a East Asia genius, takes the Western travel journey mythos, that storyline, and punctuates it by East Asian moments of enlightenment. So each haiku poem is an East Asian moment. For the essence of East Asian wisdom takes no time at all to record and takes no space at all. That the 17 syllables, the 3 movements of a haiku, are not so much a counting of syllables, 5 syllables for the first line, 7 for the second line, 5 for the third line, but those 17 movements of a haiku are like the phantom ticks of a time motion whose record is of an instant that does not occur in time. And the 17 is because the classic Buddhist Abhidhamma analysis of a moment of reality had 16 parts. 8 parts of which could be spelled out, and 8 which occur always together as a trill. So the spokes of the Dharma chakra, the wheel of truth, have 16 spokes. But it has a center hub, a 17th locus that is not included in the counting of the spokes, and when one gets to the hub, the spokes have vanished. So the 17-part movement of a haiku is the preparatory 16 parts that would be a Western characterization plus the movement out of time, out of space that occurs but does not leave any kind of trace whatsoever. So the 17 syllables of a haiku are not to be counted in Western fashion, but to be looked at in Zen style as a singularity. And one might say metaphor mixing East and West types of language and linguistic characterization, literary criticism. One might say that the 17 syllables of a haiku prepare you to forget that there are syllables. And that these are set as punctuations in a journey so that one can forget that the journey has a beginning, a middle, and an end. That at every instance where Basho puts a haiku, the journey penetrates through the world of time-space into the world of eternity. And so wonderful is the artistic personality and quality of those world-class artists that one of the greatest of all Western writers, a woman named Virginia Woolf, wrote a Zen travelogue called To the Lighthouse, where she put into the lighthouse all of the qualities of Basho's haiku-like language, both distributed throughout the entire stream of consciousness of her writing and the singular realization of a stroke that is missing from a painting that symbolizes the journey to the lighthouse. And that Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, when we read it in the symbols section, at the very end of the symbols section, we'll have a pair of texts at that time. At the beginning of the symbols section, we'll have Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse and William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying. Both of them are Western works that incorporate the Eastern realization that transcends time-space. But do it in a Western way. Instead of it being a moment of enlightenment, the moment is distributed throughout the entire fabric of the artwork. And just as the haiku moment in Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse is distributed in the stream of consciousness language throughout the entirety of her novel, so too Faulkner, and As I Lay Dying, distributes it in stream of consciousness throughout the entire novel. And when we see Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, one reads it and finds there's no narrator. There are only a number of characters whose experience is given in terms of that character, but there's no narration linking them in between. And the fact that there's a story at all is courtesy of the reader who is reading this. And if one reads it in high conscious way and obviates one's narrative addictive process and simply reads what's there, As I Lay Dying occurs simply as a group of characters who do not search for an author. We'll get to that in another 6 months, 5 months, and we'll have a time with it when we get to it. Right now we're with Basho, and we're with Jesse L. Weston's From Ritual to Romance. And I'm using a kind of circumspect way of talking. I'm using a magical kind of language. One cannot say anything meaningfully direct. If you reduce it down to A, B, C on an instructive level, that reduces integration down to simple ritual level and completely obviates the entire differential qualities of consciousness. Anyone who settles for instruction can learn to assemble and disassemble a gun and shoot someone on instruction, per instruction. But you cannot learn anything about art. You cannot learn anything about the cosmos. You cannot learn anything about symbols. And you can't even get into the process of mythology. So if you want instruction, you're asking for a recursion back to a ritual level of learning, which was good Paleolithically, but hasn't been a complete service to our kind for many thousands, tens of thousands of years. Let's look at something in terms of language for a moment, because we're broaching now the mythic horizon, the process where language as an ocean parallels the ocean of nature. Language and nature are like parallel oceans, and they're held into relationality by an objective line that is ritual existence. The line of existence, the alignment of things and their objectivity, makes this plane of existence which holds together, by virtue of its gravity, the waters below and the waters above. At the moment of creation, the waters below and the waters above separate. And that separation is one of the qualities of Indra, freeing the waters. Or even just the birth of Indra separates heaven and earth, which were one before, but one not so much as a oneness of nature, but one in the sense of two different oceans being annealed together. And as soon as the birth of an actual mythic figure occurs, like Indra, they separate. And the line, the alignment, that horizon of myth begins to curve itself away from the curve of the earth. And instead of finding this quality of something just orbiting and its straight line mimicking the curve of a center of gravity, one begins to find this opening up almost as like a bubble, almost as like a dome. And so as myth becomes energized and born, and it is born through mythic figures beginning to achieve the experiences of their actuality, then heaven begins to arch like a dome above the plane of the earth. And as the arch of the dome of heaven comes above the earth, there's a complementary arch of the dome of the afterlife or the underworld. And so the plane of the earth becomes a central plane within a sphere, eventually, of two domes. The above world and the afterworld, the other world. The world beyond life and the world beyond the earth. And so the stars and the denizens and places of the underworld begin, through the development of the mythic horizon, to have not only a place but a time. And existence gains. It becomes not only earth but terra firma, becomes more the plane upon which one can count for objectivity to occur. Now the development of a mythos, of the swelling of the mythic horizon into the dome of heaven, in the complementary swelling of the dome of the afterlife into the dome of the netherworld. These complementations together, this opening up of two bubbles, two swells that fit together in some larger whole, are tied up with the veracity of ritual. Ritual must maintain itself in its accuracy for these two to maintain their relationality. For if ritual is not exact enough, if the truth of existence does not have its gravity, then the above world and the below world will separate. They will drift farther and farther apart. And as they do, it will dismember the unity of life. So this quality of the unity of life is ensured by the accuracy of ritual, making sure that existence is objective enough to provide the gravity of holding heaven and earth together, even though they are now paired. But it's the pairing of heaven and earth that's important to existence. In language, because language characterizes this mythic swelling, this mythic bubble, this development. In language, when it is informed by the developments of an interior symbolic realm of objectivity, the mind, and it has the capacity to transform into visions of conscious differentiation, so much so that the objective forms of person occur. Then language has in its operative structure a declension quality called persons, and there are generally three: first person, second person, third person. The first person, the I; the second person, the you; the third person, the we or the they. Now this declension of activity, of action, the declension of language in terms of first, second, and third person, was a bone of contention early on in the 20th century. In the development of linguistics, this became a remarkable arena, the way in which language processed by person phases, the first, second, and third person declensions. The way in which this happened became an issue and a problem. In fact, in a book called Problems in General Linguistics, a man named Emile Benveniste, very formative in the way in which linguistic problems were seen earlier in the 20th century, came to see, when talking about ritual happenings, talked about what he called speech acts. And that speech acts have, in the Benveniste typology, have a kind of a dichotomy where the third person drops out more or less, and it's the dichotomy, the dialogue between the first and second person. So that this, and one can see in terms of our education, this is a reductive movement and action. One can see that the ego and the identity, remember we talked about last week of how there's a quaternary that develops in the sense of an ego, the me, and then the I, which is always the I, and then the individuality, which is a balancing of the ego and the I, and then a transformation where there is a visionary person who goes beyond the balancing of the individual. The individual maintains themselves by balancing the ego and the I, whereas the person transforms the individuality into a differential consciousness, which then has relationality. And rather than having to balance ego and I all the time in order to maintain itself, the person is differentially other than the individual. The person is able in their relationalities to have a kaleidoscopic relationality of many variations, indeed almost unlimited variations. The freedom of the conscious person is the freedom of someone who is like a great artist in acting. A great actor can be many individuals, can play many individuals, can balance an ego and an I in many different varieties and ways. And a very great actor is able, as an artist, to present the problems of the individual balancing an ego and I in many varieties, and it in no way compromises their person. This is the high art of consciousness. This is radically different. No tribal person on the ritual level can act. It would be an unthinkable, unimaginable action. For acting as if something were the case in the integral cycle is falling for semblances rather than the reality, and this is the very object of ritual veracity, not to permit this to happen. If you're just going through the motions, this is regressive ritual. This is to be guarded against. And so one sees here that there are great warring capacities that come. Now, let's look at person declensions in language. If you take the third person out and leave just the first and second person in a dichotomy, the me, which is that kind of second person which includes the you, and the I, which is just I, and you do not have the third person, the we, or the they, one has this kind of struggle where there is no balance possible because there's no balancer, and there's also no transformation. No person comes out of a dichotomy like that. Instead, one has a conflictual confusion that occurs. One then has only one concern, and that is to keep the subjective quite distinct from the objective, and you get into a subject-object conflict, in which case the so-called individuality would be but a projection of either the I or the me. Would be a projection which the I would have to always win. This dichotomy, this eliminating the third person, the we and the they, and incidentally this becomes true on a very delicate level in Martin Heidegger's Being in Time, Sein und Zeit. The inauthentic is characterized by the they self. So one gets into an existential bind by not keeping the balance of individuality, which is the balance of the we and the they, which is the ground which transforms into the person. One comes into a locked, beleaguered dichotomy which characterizes neurotic action. And This comes to characterize a language and a language process when it falls into an over-analytical devolution. Now, on the other hand, there are great developments of tribal intelligence which not only allow for three-person declension in language, but also fourth and fifth person. The American Indian Algonquin family of languages have fourth and fifth person declensions, so that one can relate narrative and speech in such a complicated, variegated way that to translate out of Algonquin into English, for instance, reduces down to a degraded level what is being said. Very often, the old typological situation where the natives talk pidgin English and therefore are stupid and primitive because they can't speak the king's English. If the king's English teacher could have learned the native language, would have discovered that they speak in a very kaleidoscopic universe of relationalities that include at least five-person declensioning. And that the very elegance of Algonquin language was such that one could say at length the most exquisite relational patterns of experience and consciousness imaginable. The Iroquois, for instance, were famous once the Iroquois speakers were understood. And we talked about how Whitman's poem on Red Jacket, the greatest of all the Iroquois orators, staggered Whitman's sense of proportion once at an unveiling of a statue. The fame of the ability for Blackfoot speakers to frame all the delicate nuances of consciousness involved in a situation allowed for the great Blackfoot generation who faced a possible termination like all other Plains Indian tribes through warfare. It allowed for the Blackfoot nation as a whole, because Blackfoot is a dialect, a subtongue of the Algonquin language. It allowed for the Blackfoot to understand very accurately a situation which previously they had never run across, and to sign peace treaties, obviating the need for a conflict, a war, which would have wiped them out as an independent people. And in this case, the Blackfoot as a nation signed treaties with both the governments of Canada and the United States as independent nations. They used their ability for fourth and fifth person declensions to build an imaginative construct of what it was they were dealing with and the severity of the problem. And under leaders like Crowfoot and Running Rabbit were able to mastermind a situation where they still exist as independent peoples. A Blackfoot in Canada can travel to and from the United States at will because they are members of a sovereign country that have sovereign treaties with both nations. They are citizens of both nations and are not encumbered by the borders, by the customs agents of either nation. And when they travel abroad, they travel under dual passport. The ability of primordial peoples, you can see why we don't call them primitive, is to also develop within themselves a civilization that includes vision. So that one has to finally give over the old 19th century idea that American Indians were always tribal, and to recognize that some American Indian populations were civilized, and that there's such a thing as American Indian civilization. And that when one realizes this and recognizes this, you realize that what symbolically characterizes a civilization are great cities. Where are the great American cities? And one has to go no further than across the Mississippi River from St. Louis, Missouri. Cahokia, which was an American Indian city that had 50,000 people in it more than 1,000 years ago. And that American Indian civilization had sophisticatedly developed itself to such an extent that their cosmos included a return to nature so complete that when the Europeans came to their civilized land, they thought it was a wilderness and didn't recognize that it was a garden of a very sophisticated civilization. And so the intelligence of the 21st century completely is shocked by the ineptness of the 19th century, which unfortunately continues throughout the 20th century to be accepted as if it were the story and nothing further needed to be learned. At one time, the American continent, all the way from the Mississippi River to the Atlantic coast, all of that land was embossed with earth mounds in the shapes of symbols and animals and geometric processes, so that the entire land of the eastern United States, the eastern third of the United States, was a tattooed tapestry of a high civilization, now plowed under so many times over as to be almost effaced and leaving just a few mounds here and there. But once upon a time, in the 1830s, when most of it was still intact in the Midwest, before the states of Illinois and Indiana and Michigan and Ohio were incorporated into the Union, when it was still a territory, the great Fox Indian shaman De Kuda took a man named Walter Pidgeon, not the actor, took him across the landscape and explained to him, and Pidgeon wrote a book, which was published in 1840, about the thousands and tens of thousands of mounds that characterized, in their typology, that characterized the American landscape. The American land was a sacred, symbolic tapestry of American Indian civilization, and not at all a jumbled, fearful wilderness that was seen by the European incursion at the time in the projected light of their own egos and their own senses of identity, and in no way were conscious enough to see the transcendental personage of a civilization that didn't resemble theirs at all. One can go very far along these lines. The point for us here is that we are living in projected ignorances that are not even adequate to the moment, much less the future rapidly coming of a new civilization. We can hardly even swim in the waters which are here above our heads now, much less make way by artistic technique towards new civilization that is absolutely essential. We're going to come back in Ritual 10 and talk about the Rig-Vedic origins of the Arthurian Grail legends, and about the way in which Zen language literature replaced ritual warfare in the great artistic heritage of Basho. Basho's male ancestors were samurai. They used a sword and the flick of a sword hand, the glint of steel, to make their way in the world, whereas Basho used language bent over itself many times like a samurai sword steel, and then used the flick of language so that the glint of a single word could perform the work of a samurai sword. And Basho made his way in the world as a samurai of language. So that the haiku is not some little daisy in some little gentle child's garden of verses, but is the most penetrating of all linguistic forms on the planet. And when one looks for colossal cosmic level dexterousness in artistic language to show penetration through to the real, one doesn't have to go any further than Basho, who lived already 350 years ago. More next week. Thank you.